All right, so should I start or would you
Yeah,
like to start?
yeah.
All right. So hey everyone, my name is Mateo Hermida. I am a housing paralegal with Legal Aid Services of Oregon. I also do work as an outreach worker for our organization. So that entails presentations like this, doing some community outreach, stuff like that. And I'll let Shannon introduce herself. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Shannon Garcia. I am a staff attorney at Legal Aid Services of Oregon. I focus primarily on housing, and I use she, her pronouns.
Oh yes, and I use he, him pronouns. So I want to clarify that. So today, we've been kind of in conversation with Don't You Portland and kind of getting an idea of some of the things that tenants are dealing with, especially protesters, due to their involvement with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the protests here in downtown. So a lot of what we heard about is, retaliation from landlords, discrimination from landlords as a result of that involvement. So that's a pretty unique situation. So I don't know that what the information that we're going to share today is, exactly pertinent to it, but we're going to try to provide a brief overview of both federal and state fair housing law, just to give folks an idea of, what constitutes housing discrimination, what to look out for. And I mean, the other thing that's important to know, right, is the Black Lives Matter movement is a social movement, but it's one that's, deeply intertwined with race and color, issues of race and color. So you could see how, even though, involvement in the social movement may or may not be considered a protected class, some of the retaliation that we're being told about can kind of veer into that fair housing area, just due to the fact that it's obviously so deeply intertwined with race and color. So yeah, I'll start by basically providing a brief overview of, what folks are protected by fair housing law, what kind of housing is protected by fair housing law, what kind of activities or actions are prohibited, basically, what's considered discrimination. So basically the protected classes differ depending on whether or not you're observing it at a federal level or at a state level. So federally, the protected classes are race, color, and religion. Those were established by the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Later on, sex and familial status, national origin, and disability were also established as protected classes under federal law. And then when we look at Oregon kind of expanded it a little bit. So Oregon also includes marital status, source of income, so that can include, Section 8 vouchers, folks that receive assistance from a community organization, right? So, let's say somebody's getting, their rent paid for by an organization like Self-Enhancement Inc., for example. A landlord can't be discriminating based off that assistance. So that's what it means to discriminate based on source of income. Sexual orientation is also included, and that includes, of course, gender identity. And the other thing to note is that protections continue to expand, right? So in some cities and counties in Oregon, age and occupation are also considered protected classes under city and county ordinances. So yeah, it's just important to note, like, depending on your jurisdiction, your protections may or may not, be a lot more extensive than they would be in other places, right? And then, of course, it is just for the purpose of this presentation important to note that, political beliefs are not necessarily a protected class, though we will kind of go into some of the protections that exist for tenants that choose to organize. So yeah, we'll get into more detail about that when we'll kind of discuss retaliation, harassment, and housing.
All right, so we're creating kind of a narrative arc here. So Mateo talked to you about what is a privileged or protected class, and that's going to be important to remember as we kind of go through our presentation here, is because we're pulling together ingredients to present a compelling story when and if we are in a courtroom, and we have to show some things in order to kind of get through a case. So Mateo talked about protected class. I'm going to talk about what housing is covered. So under federal law, covered housing includes any dwelling unit, and dwelling is any building or structure that is intended for occupancy. And the folks who are protected are folks who are buying, renting, or residing in a dwelling. Things that don't count as a dwelling under federal law include dormitories, group homes, or manufactured home parks. So there are some exemptions under the federal law that essentially boil down to small landlords with 3 or fewer homes who do not employ a property manager or a rental manager. Small owner-occupied buildings are exempt. Religious organizations or member-based organizations who are renting based on membership, and senior housing. So those are the carve-outs under federal law. In state covered housing is any real property, and anybody who is buying, renting, or residing in real property is covered under state protections. There aren't any exemptions for small landlords under the state housing scheme. There are exemptions for senior housing, and there are some exemptions for landlord occupied homes. But we don't want to get too in the weeds on that. So, so we have our protected people, we have our housing. Now, what are the prohibited actions? So fair housing laws protect against discrimination in admissions and availability. So this is screening. And where we see this come up a lot for folks is in criminal background checks, people trying to look at unrelated crimes that aren't going to have any impact on one's tenancy, and holding people as non-rentable because of those criminal convictions. Or even charges that come up. So we aren't going to talk about the fair ordinance in Portland today, but there is a fair ordinance. We'd be happy to talk about it in the future. Just know that there are strict criteria on what landlords can and cannot exclude tenancy for, and we would love to talk more in the future if people think they've been unfairly excluded from housing. Other prohibited actions include different treatment in terms or conditions. So where does this come up? It can come up in the form of unfair rent increases, limiting access to common space. All sorts of things can come under this. So try to think big, like what is a thing that other people have access to or aren't being subjected to that I am. It protects against discriminatory statements or advertisements. You know, we don't see anymore the blatant Section 8 vouchers need not apply, or we don't rent to families, but there are things that come up in conversation. So these are going to be more, come up more in passing than maybe necessarily in a Craigslist ad, but if it does come up in a Craigslist ad, certainly take a screenshot and call us. So false representations of availability. We know this happens a lot. Hi, I'm calling for an apartment, but I might have an accent or convey a certain culture that is apart from white dominant culture, and then the person on the other line says, sorry, we don't have any vacancies. Again, the fair ordinance touches on this a little bit, so if folks have questions about that, we'd be happy to talk offline. Then there's block busting and steering. So these ones are interesting. Mateo and I kind of went back and forth, like, is this happening in rental or not? But what we see this coming up in is those informal evictions. So, hey, look, we think we can terminate you. If you have an eviction on your record, you're not going to be able to get housing anywhere. You should probably just move out on your own. I'll give you $50 for your trouble. Just move out on your own and you won't have a problem. So convincing people to move out of their own home or not move into a home. Like, oh, are you sure you and your family are going to be comfortable here? Like, it's a predominantly white complex. You're a BIPOC family. I just don't think you're going to be happy here. Maybe you should consider renting someplace else. That's an example of block busting or steering. And then the last thing that we'll touch on a little bit more, like Mateo said, is interfering with someone asserting their rights under the Fair Housing Act or Oregon Housing Protections.
Absolutely. And the one thing that I also want to point out is that we have a wonderful partnership with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. So when Shannon is discussing some of these prohibited activities, some of you may be thinking, well, that would be very hard to prove, right? So she said sometimes, things get mentioned in passing, or, it's kind of difficult to know, am I being denied housing right now because I'm a person of color or because of my sexual orientation. Those are all things that are usually very hard to prove. So the benefit of having a partnership with Fair Housing Council of Oregon is that they have what's called testers. So they basically have these folks go out and basically they're secret shoppers to some extent, right? They, people of different backgrounds, different races basically go and apply for housing and try to see if there's a difference in the response depending on their race or, their part in some other protected class, right? So that's just something to take note of. And, that's kind of the main purpose of this presentation, right? Is, like I said, some of the stuff that we're presenting may or may not be pertinent to your individual situation, but at the very least, what we want to do is let you know that you have us as a resource, you have some of our community partners as a resource. So reach out. At the very least, we could talk about it, see if it is housing discrimination, and then maybe subsequently take action. I don't know, right? So reach out is the point. So the next thing that I'm going to be talking about is harassment, right? Because like I mentioned, conversations with Gulf Street Portland and through the wonderful outreach that they've been doing in the community, they've gotten a hold of a lot of tenants and they've heard about many of the issues that they're dealing with, right? And one of these is harassment. So harassment, can take many different forms, right? Two of the more explicitly defined forms by HUD are quid pro quo harassment is the first. So basically many of you know what quid pro quo means, but it's this for that basically, right? So it's basically asking a person to engage in some sort of unwelcome conduct in exchange for getting or maintaining housing or housing related services, right? So, an example of that could be maybe in admissions, right? A woman who wears a hijab, for example, applies for housing and the landlord says to her, I'll give you the place on the condition that you don't wear it. That would be a quid pro quo form of harassment, and you should reach out to us or Fair Housing Council of Oregon or some other sort of legal entity to get help with that as soon as possible because it's unacceptable. Another one that we kind of pondered is, for example, a landlord saying, hey, I'll do repairs, but you have to take down that Black Lives Matter, sign or flag or whatever you have, right? That's something that may come up because again, it's not, the social movement is not explicitly defined as a protected class, but a social movement that's so deeply intertwined with race, such a statement may or may not be considered housing discrimination. So again, at the very least, reach out to us and we can try to talk about it. And this is all really important, right? So I was just kind of while preparing for this presentation, just looking up some statistics and stuff like that, right? So the Southern Poverty Law Center, for example, noted that there was, a significant increase in harassment based on protected class since 2016. We can all guess why that is. And according to their statistics, 32% of those incidents occur in housing, right? So it's something to watch out for. That's a pretty sizable chunk of, hateful harassment basically happening in housing situations, in the housing context. So it's something to look out for. And then the other type of housing harassment that I want to talk about is a hostile living environment, right? So basically this just means any sort of conduct or behavior that becomes so severe and pervasive, happens so commonly that, it disturbs the tenant's right to peaceful enjoyment of their home, which, by the way, under Oregon landlord tenant law, tenants do have the right to peaceful enjoyment of their dwelling units of their homes. So yeah, and in some cases, if a lot of people might be saying, well, if it's just one incident, is that severe and pervasive enough for me to, for it to be an actionable fair housing complaint, right? Should I be seeking help after just one incident? In some cases, it might be worthwhile doing so, because sometimes it can be something so bad, right, that it automatically creates that hostile living environment. I can only imagine that a lot of us would want to, continue to live under a landlord that even on one occasion, uttered a racial slur or something of that nature, right? So, it's worth looking into and, reaching out to somebody involved for sure. And then the other thing that, is important to take note of is a lot of the harassment that I kind of described is harassment perpetuated by the landlord or by an agent of the landlord, right? But tenant-on-tenant harassment can also create a liability for landlords. It can also be something that the tenant seeks help for. And so basically kind of what makes an actionable fair housing claim for tenant-on-tenant harassment is when, the tenant complains about, this behavior or conduct that they deem to be discriminatory to the landlord. and the landlord does not, right? So the landlord under the Fair Housing, or not under the Fair Housing Act, but under HUD's guidance on the Fair Housing Act is required to, act in some fashion, whether that be by investigating, these complaints of discrimination, or, issuing some sort of warning, notice, doing something, right? So failing to do anything basically is just as illegal as having uttered, a racial slur or something of that nature, right? You have to act as a landlord. It's basically what HUD is saying in their rules and guidances to landlords. So yeah, that's harassment.
Okay, so we're still building out like the pieces. So we talked about protected groups. We've talked about what housing is included. Mateo talked about harassment as a form of discrimination. I'm going to talk about retaliation, and then I'm going to try to put it all together so that we have a nice package for you all. But so retaliation on the federal level includes any act that coerces and intimidates, threatens, or interferes with a person exercising their rights under the Fair Housing Act. That makes those actions unlawful. And this isn't just for the people who have been retaliated against. So let's say I stood up to my landlord because I found out that they were not accepting Section 8 vouchers. And my landlord created a hostile living environment for me. But I wasn't going to say anything, except Mateo encouraged me to stand up for myself and stand up for the rights of my tenants. Mateo, who has encouraged me to assert my rights, is also protected from retaliation under federal law. I think that's really important because it can be hard to go through the grueling experience of retaliation, intimidation, harassment, especially in the world that we're living in and have been living in for some time. So to know that I myself don't have to go through the agony and still there's a way to hold a landlord to account. I think that's important. Also, if this happened to my neighbor, my friend, my family member, that means it could happen to anybody. So it has a chilling effect. So it's important that people in community with one another step up when they can. So this is a call to action for white allies. If you know that your neighbors are being racially discriminated against, encourage them to stand up for their rights. You have a cause of action too, or do it for them, do it on their behalf. Put a pound of flesh on the line to hold a landlord accountable when they're doing these acts. Okay, so under the state, we have protections against retaliation, and retaliation includes retaliatory increases in rent, decreases in services, termination of tenancy, threats to terminate tenancy, and filing of eviction. And so the actions that are protected under state law are in good faith making a complaint to your landlord about your tenancy, repairs needed, things like that. Reporting any code enforcement issues to a code enforcement agency, testifying against a landlord in court is protected, winning an eviction case within the last 6 months unless you won on some sort of technicality, you didn't win on what we call the merits, asserting or saying you will assert rights as a tenant under any tenant protection law. But the one that we want to highlight today is there's also a protection against retaliation if you join or organize a tenants union. So under state retaliation law, you have a right to organize. The beautiful thing about your right to organize is that the law does not say it has to be related to tenancy issues or tenancy alone. So this is where we can think a little bit more creatively about the movement we're in and the moment we're in right now. So if tenants are organizing behind a movement, like Don't Shoot Portland, Black Lives Matter, these movements can and of themselves form the basis for a tenants union. And if you're being retaliated against for your activities in your tenants union, that's unlawful discrimination, and we want to know about it. So think about that. We have to be creative, because at the end of the day, we're trying to show that I am a member of a protected class. I am in qualified housing. I've had an unlawful action happen against me, and that's because of my identification in a protected class or my acting in a protected way. And that's hard. So we got to use the laws that we have to our advantage. I think we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that, and I'm going to go off script a little bit here, forgive me, but I think we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that we are positioned on stolen land, and housing laws are part of a larger property scheme that we're meant to take that stolen land, put it in the hands of a few, so that low-income community members, specifically BIPOC community members, can be placed in intentional and perpetual instability and housing insecurity. It's a very important tactic in the tool of property ownership. So the laws that we are using are not meant to help every single tenant maintain and secure their housing. So we need to figure out how to pry open the very narrow grounds that we have and squeeze out the protections that we can. So to do that, Mateo talked about the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. Don't have conversations with your landlord on the phone. Do everything in text, take screenshots, save everything, put everything down in writing. Don't make any informal agreements with your landlord if you can help it. And if you can't help it, if your landlord insists on showing up and having communications with you, follow up with a text message. Hey, you came by today at 5:30 p.m. You told me that you were going to turn my water back on. You haven't done that yet. When are you going to do that? So that so you can build your record and you can create your narrative, so that when you do contact us, and I have our contact information, we can have good news for you instead of frustrating news for you. So please use our contact information, get in touch with us. I'm not really sure if you can see this, but we want to do what we can to help. If nothing else, let's see. Is that visible? It's not super visible. Anyway, we're doing what we can, but my name is Shannon Garcia. My email address is Shannon, SHANNON.Garcia @LASOREGON.org. That's lasoregon.org. And Mateo is Mateo, MATEO. Hermida, HERMIDA @lasoregon.org. Get in touch with us. Ask us questions. We don't have all the answers. We do know where to look. And if we can help folks protect and secure their housing at this time during pandemic, during unrest on the streets, I think it's an important time to do that. And it's the one way that we can use this privilege that we have under the law. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Anything else?
And I just want to add our phone number as well.
Oh,
So
yes.
you can feel free to call our main intake line. That's 503-224-4086. And if you want to talk to one of us specifically, just feel free to use our names, and our wonderful support staff members will make sure to forward the call to us. So thank you to Don't Sleep Portland for allowing us this opportunity. And let you have a fun day.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you so much for listening to us ramble and ramble and ramble. Thank you so much for the people on the streets doing the hard work for us. Black Lives Matter, and have a great day.
Yeah, no, this is great.
We did it!